Do you know those days when you just want to finish work calmly, without having to deal with any bullshit? Well, it wasn't one of those days. I was in my unmarked car, parked on the street outside my house. All I did was drive around the block, and there was the scene. A tow truck, a confused driver, and a woman with her arms crossed, clearly proud of herself, as if she had solved a major social problem. As soon as I got close, I felt her sharp gaze boring into me. It wasn't the look of someone in danger or in need of help. It was the look of someone ready to give an unsolicited lecture on rules and decorum to someone who clearly doesn't have time for it. I went straight to the winchman, who looked less comfortable than I did. He was scratching his head, looking between me and the woman, clearly not knowing how to act. "So, who called the tow truck?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "It was me. That car has been parked here for hours," she said, puffing out her chest as if she were solving a federal crime. "That's against HOA rules. We have standards, sir. We can't allow anyone to dump vehicles on the street like this." Oh, right. The blessed HOA. Always the same useless little rules. Always the same control-obsessed types. I looked at my car. No garage block. No parking signs. Absolutely nothing to justify this circus. But before I could answer, the tow truck driver snorted. He was still holding the tow truck radio, as if he was ready to call the whole thing off if someone gave him a good excuse. "Look, miss, are you sure this car doesn't belong to anyone in the neighborhood?" he asked hesitantly. The woman snorted, as if she were dealing with a bunch of incompetents. "If it did, I'd know. I'm the president of the HOA." There it was, the damn phrase, as if that title made her some kind of supreme dictator of the asphalt. But that's okay. I could play around a bit before I let it sink in. I crossed my arms and looked thoughtful. "I get it. So this car is parked illegally and needs to be removed?" "Exactly," she smiled, clearly pleased to have finally found someone who understood. I took a step to the side and knocked lightly on the vehicle's bodywork. "Well, then I guess I have a problem, ma'am, because this car is a police car." Her smile died faster than ice cream on hot asphalt. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The tow truck driver let out a heavy sigh, as if he had already foreseen the bureaucratic headache this was going to cause. And that's how it started. A mess that, honestly, I would never have believed if I hadn't lived through it. Because this woman, instead of admitting her mistake and stopping there, decided to double down. And that's when things got really interesting. If there's one thing I've learned after years on the force, it's that some people just don't know how to back down, no matter how obvious their mistake. It doesn't matter if the whole world is watching and expecting them to just put their head down and move on. Some people prefer to sink even deeper, digging their own hole with their fingernails if necessary. And that woman? She was the kind of person who, when she realizes she's stuck her foot in the mud, decides to dive in and call it her private lake. She stood there, frozen, processing the information as if I had just told her that the car was actually a spaceship. Her eyes jumped from the car to me, from the car to the tow truck, from the tow truck back to me, as if trying to find a mistake in what I'd said. "Is that a police car?" she stammered, as if it was the first time in her life that someone had dared to contradict her. "Yes, ma'am. An unmarked car, to be exact," I replied, taking the opportunity to open my wallet and show my badge. If she was pale before, now she looked as if someone had drained all the blood from her face. But instead of swallowing her pride and admitting her mistake, she decided it was an excellent idea to double the bet. "That doesn't change anything," she shot back, quickly pulling herself together. "That car is parked in an unauthorized place, and as a representative of the HOA, I have the right to call a tow truck whenever someone breaks the rules of the neighborhood." The tow truck driver looked at me with that, "For God's sake, don't get me involved in this" expression. And I swear I considered for a moment just laughing and walking away. But honestly, I wanted to see how far that woman would go with this crazy thing. I crossed my arms and feigned a tone of sincere curiosity. "Ah, so you mean the HOA has authority over police vehicles now?" "It's not about whether you're a cop or not," she shouted, getting more and more nervous. "If the car doesn't have permission to be here, it must be removed." I could hear the squealer holding his breath next to me. The guy was genuinely hoping that woman would give up before she got into worse trouble. But no, not only did she not stop, she decided to deliver the final blow. With a dramatic movement, she reached into her handbag and pulled out a pad of paper. A pad of fines. HOA fines. I almost choked with laughter. Yes, she actually started filling out a ticket, with that look of satisfaction as if she had just pulled a +4 on the Uno and completely screwed me. The tow truck driver's eyes widened as if he couldn't believe his eyes. "Are you fining the police?" he asked, trying to understand what alternative reality he had woken up in that morning. "I'm ticketing a car that doesn't comply with HOA regulations," he replied, scribbling on the sheet with an absurd determination. That's when I realized that I wasn't just dealing with a stubborn woman. No, this was something bigger. This was Karen at the supreme level, and I needed to see where this was going. "And how much is that fine?" I asked, trying not to laugh. $200, he replied, detaching the sheet of paper and handing it to me with the authority of someone enforcing the law. I took the ticket and looked at the details. She really had filled out everything correctly. The name of the HOA, my crime of improper parking, the amount of the infraction. There was even a threat of legal action if payment wasn't made within 7 days. I couldn't stand it. I started to laugh. Not a discreet laugh, not a restrained giggle. I just burst out laughing, which only made her even angrier. "That's not funny," she shouted. But it was. My God, it was. I took a deep breath, trying to regain some seriousness. "Ma'am, I just wanted to let you know that this ticket is worthless," I said, still with a little smile on my face. "The HOA has no authority over police vehicles, much less over officers on duty." "But you're not in uniform. This car doesn't have sirens. How was I supposed to know?" By now she was desperate, trying to find some way out of the situation without admitting that she had screwed up. "It doesn't have sirens because it's unmarked," I explained patiently. "Like most vehicles used for surveillance and special operations." She crossed her arms, snorting. "Still, rules are rules." The tow truck driver, who until then had been immobile, decided that was his cue to leave. Right. I don't think we need a tow truck here, do we?" he said, walking over to the truck and picking up the radio to cancel the call. The woman still tried to object, but I was tired of the clown show. I took the ticket and tore it in half, letting the pieces fall to the asphalt. The shock on her face was priceless. "You can't do that." "Of course I can," I replied. "Just as I can give you a real fine for calling an emergency service unnecessarily. Now I can." Now she shut up. For the first time since I got out of the car, I could see a glimmer of real panic in her eyes. A real ticket? Oh yes, $500 for that. Maybe even a little investigation into abuse of authority. After all, trying to tow a police car and give an officer a ticket, that sounds like something the sheriff would love to hear. Her silence was the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed in my entire career. But if you think she gave up there, my friend, you still don't understand the kind of person I was dealing with. If there's one thing I've learned in my work, it's that there are two types of people. Those who, when cornered, take a deep breath, accept their mistake and try to get out of it with a minimum of dignity. And those who, when cornered, dig an even deeper hole, jump in and start shouting that it's the system's fault. Guess which category this woman fell into? Exactly. Her face went through a roller coaster of emotions. First came shock, then indignation, and finally, a slight touch of despair when she realized that I was serious about the $500 fine for calling an emergency service unnecessarily. She attempted a forced smile. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. Oh, right. Now it was a misunderstanding. Because 5 minutes ago, I was a criminal who needed to be thrown out of her neighborhood with a tow truck and everything. I took advantage of her silence to pull out my ticket book, which, unlike the useless little paper from the HOA, had real value. Full name? I asked, without even looking at her. Her expression twitched, as if she had just bitten into a bad lemon. I don't see the need to. I raised an eyebrow. Full name, I repeated. She gave me a murderous look. Karen. I wasn't surprised. Last name, Karen? She huffed, crossing her arms so hard it looked like she was going to dislocate a shoulder. Stevenson. I wrote it down, while listening to the squealer whistling softly in the background, clearly enjoying the whole thing. Address? She hesitated. By now, I knew her address. It was listed in the HOA, and, frankly, after so many bizarre calls coming from that area, I had the number memorized. But I wanted to see how far her resistance went. That's not necessary, she shouted. This is absurd. I'm the victim here. Oh, yes, of course you are. Because nothing says victim like being caught calling a tow truck for a police car and then trying to ticket an officer. I took a deep breath and looked straight into her eyes. Ma'am, you called an emergency service for a problem that didn't exist. That means a waste of public resources. And that, as you can imagine, is a crime. She opened her mouth to retort, but I continued before she could put her foot in it any further. What's more, I could very well call for backup right now and ask for an investigation into abuse of authority. You lied when you said this car was abandoned, and you tried to take advantage of a position. You don't even have to apply unfounded sanctions. For the first time, I saw a glint of pure panic in her eyes. Ah, so now she understood. Her pose changed. Suddenly, her shoulders slumped a little, her mouth tightened, and she began to stare at the ground, as if making mental calculations of how much it would cost to get out of this situation without too much damage. The winchman, who until that moment had been trying his best not to laugh out loud, decided to be merciful and cut the tension. So, I can leave, right? Because if you don't have a car to tow away, I really have better things to do. Yes, you can, I replied, as I finished filling in the ticket. He nodded with a smile, climbed into the cab, and started the truck, leaving behind only the roar of the engine and a completely defeated Karen. She looked at me with a mixture of anger and despair as I handed over the ticket. $500. That's ridiculous. I smiled. Yes, ridiculous. Just like calling a tow truck for a police car. She snorted so loudly that it sounded like she was going to explode. But, to my surprise, instead of continuing the show, she picked up the ticket with trembling fingers and stuffed it into her handbag. For a moment, I thought she had finally accepted defeat. But no, she wasn't going to get out of this without trying one last blow. And, my friend, her last attempt at revenge was worthy of one of those epic fail videos on the internet. Because Karen, instead of simply paying the fine and getting on with her life, decided that the best strategy was to call the police on the police themselves. Yes, she picked up her cell phone, dialed 911 in front of me and said, with all the confidence in the world, "I'd like to report a case of police abuse." I swear for a second, I thought I'd heard wrong. But no, she really was trying to do that. I stood there, watching as she tried to explain to the attendant that an unidentified police officer was coercing her and giving her unfair fines. Now, let me tell you a secret. We have internal codes for absurd situations like this. When an emergency call is made in a clearly ridiculous way, the attendant can categorize the occurrence so that we receive the call immediately. In other words, the system itself already knew it was bullshit and notified me on my radio before any other police officer even considered answering. I let her finish her brilliant explanation and only then put my hand to the radio on my shoulder. Unit 402, responding to police abuse call at 56 Maple Street. The suspect is in front of me. Her face went white. I could hear her brain desperately trying to work out how to get out of the mess. She couldn't. The dispatcher confirmed that the call was, in fact, an unfounded joke and canceled it immediately. Karen hung up the phone with the expression of someone who has just seen her whole life flash before her eyes. I crossed my arms. Any other jokes you'd like to try? Or can we call it a night? And finally, she shut up. But I knew that wasn't the end of it. Because when someone like that is defeated, they don't learn their lesson. They just get more dangerous. And I was about to find that out the hard way. You know that saying that pride comes before a fall? Well, what happened next was more than a fall. It was an Olympic leap into the abyss, with a pirouette and a landing right at the bottom. Karen could have gone home, paid the fine, and got on with her life. But she didn't. She decided to double her bet again. And that's when the real show began. Over the next few days, I began to notice that the neighborhood was different. First, I received a call in the same neighborhood. Someone had reported a suspicious car parked for long periods. It was my car. This time, a different policeman went to answer the call. The poor guy arrived at the scene and immediately recognized me. When he saw that the report was about the unmarked police car I was using, he just let out a long sigh, turned to me and said, "Let me guess, the crazy HOA." I nodded. Yes, it was her. She was calling the police every day reporting suspicious vehicles, strange people, and even illegal activities in the neighborhood. And, strangely, all the calls were to the same street, the same area, always trying to attract the police to the same area. I made a point of checking the reports. In the last 3 days, Karen had called the police 11 times, making all sorts of absurd claims. Basically, she was trying to give me hell. But you see, I'm patient. I have years of experience dealing with difficult people. I could just ignore it. The problem? She didn't stop there. The following week, I discovered that Karen was handing out fake tickets around the neighborhood. That's right. She had printed up flyers with the HOA letterhead, probably copied from some official document, and started dumping fines in neighbors' mailboxes. Some were ridiculous, like $50 for a poorly trimmed lawn, but others went up to an absurd $300 for parking on the street, which, by the way, was completely permitted. The HOA began to receive angry calls. Many residents began to contest the fines. Some threatened to sue the association. And it was at this point that its reign began to crumble. A group of neighbors went to the HOA's headquarters to demand an explanation. When they discovered that the fines were false and that the HOA had never approved them, they began to call for her removal as president. But Karen, being Karen, decided that the best response was to shout louder and double down again. "I'm protecting this neighborhood from slobs and criminals," she bellowed to a group of residents, all looking at her as if they had just realized that she was completely crazy. I was there when it happened. The vice president of the HOA, a calm and patient gentleman, held up a folder of documents and declared for all to hear. The HOA does not recognize any of these fines, and Karen no longer has the authority to speak for the association. The silence that followed was beautiful. I swear I saw her soul leaving her body. But of course, she couldn't accept defeat. "You need me. Without me, this neighborhood will be a mess," she kept shouting, while the neighbors murmured, shook their heads, and recorded everything with their cell phones. And then came the final blow. "They're trying to destroy me because I reported a corrupt policeman," she shouted, pointing directly at me. Ah, that's it. She wanted to take everyone with her. Now I was ready for it. Before the meeting, I went to the police station and picked up a complete dossier on the false accusations she had made over the last few days. As soon as she accused me, I took the papers out of my pocket and handed them to the vice president of the HOA. "Here are all the unfounded allegations Karen made against the police this past week," I said. "If you want to add more evidence against her, feel free." Karen tried to snatch the papers out of the vice president's hands, but he pulled away and started reading aloud. "Suspicious car on the street. Strange man prowling the neighborhood. Illegal activities taking place at night. All made up, right?" The woman turned red, then purple, then white. The neighbors began to murmur louder. An elderly woman in front even crossed her arms and said, "That woman is a danger." And then came the best moment of all. The vice president looked straight at me and said, "Officer, what can we do about it?" And I smiled. 2 weeks later, Karen was no longer president of the HOA. In fact, she didn't even live in the neighborhood anymore. The HOA decided to file a lawsuit against her for misuse of official documents and fraudulent charges. In addition, since the fines she issued were technically trying to extort money from the neighbors, some people filed BOs against her for fraud. Oh, and remember the false reports to the police. That also came into play. She tried to defend herself. She tried to argue. She even tried to cry in court. Oh yes, because she was taken to court, but to no avail. The judge was ruthless. She was ordered to pay all the real fines issued against her, had to return money to some residents who had actually paid the false infractions, and even got her name sullied in the city. In short, she lost everything. In the end, I never had to lift a finger against her. It destroyed itself. The neighbors knocked it down. The HOA kicked her out, and her own stupidity sealed the fate that, frankly, had been waiting for her since the moment she tried to ticket a police car. Some people learn their lesson. Others only serve as examples of what not to do in life. Karen was in the second group, and honestly, it was a pleasure to see it all happen. If you also liked this video, don't forget to subscribe and like it.